ahead and hand it off to our last speaker, Dr. Abirafi, who just released your new book earlier this year, correct, in February, if I remember, titled Freedom of the Frontlines, Afghan Women and the Fallacy of Liberation. So I will go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And to my fellow panelists, you all are amazing. Your work is important. And I think it's made all the more urgent now with what's happening around the world and certainly in this country and also tomorrow. I feel like we are facing so many different front lines and it is frightening. And at the risk of sounding alarmist and dramatic, the enemy is everywhere, really, more so than I ever imagined. I spent over 2 decades working overseas, working in humanitarian emergencies, working on sexual violence across countries like Afghanistan, in Haiti, Nepal, Mali, Central African Republic, Congo, Chad, Niger, all over the place, and also in the Arab region. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but did not expect in my return to the US after all of that time abroad that the front lines would be here as well, and that we'd have so much work to do. I was the kid who at 16 years old was out protesting in front of clinics and protecting women as they were trying to gain access. And that was many decades ago. So, here I am over 30 years later, not only still screaming the same things, and I feel like I'm holding up the same signs, but also facing so much more backlash to the work that we thought was done and the gains we thought were solidified. So collectively, for all of us, I'm very sorry for that. So I work on women and girls, and that is the lens through which I view everything, recognizing that we are centuries from equality all around the world, in this country as well. We don't want to talk about it, but certainly the US is not faring any better and is probably faring worse than many countries. We're looking at 132 years, I think, until we close the gender gap, which I don't think I'll see in my lifetime. Despite my aspirations, I certainly think we should hurry it up. All around the world, this continues to get worse. So, we're going backwards. In my capacity working on violence against women across humanitarian emergencies, have, of course, dealt with refugee and migrant populations as those who are among the most vulnerable, women and girls who are on the move, who are left alone, who are without family, who lack the social safety nets that being in their place and space and community and family and network and village bring. So the risks that they face are so much worse. So recognizing and understanding those vulnerabilities and trying to provide access to these women and support and services that they need very critically, especially if they are survivors of violence or at risk of it. How do you service populations that are on the move? So those kinds of challenges were very much a part of my work over 2 decades in all of these places. And then in 2015, I decided that I needed to stay in one place for a little bit, moved to Beirut, Lebanon, and took up the position of executive director of the Arab Institute for Women, which is an academic and activist institute that covers the 22 Arab states. So also incredible challenges. You probably know the region very well, multiple protracted crises that show clearly no signs of abating. And as a result, a lot of people, a lot of women and girls, once again, moving and facing great risks in doing so, and being based in Lebanon, as my Palestinian Lebanese sister has started to tell us, brings a lot of risks and vulnerabilities, and survival is just extremely precarious. So how to manage all of these refugee populations when, at the same time, new forms of violence are being created. They're at risk of trafficking, and sexual exploitation certainly is rampant, and forced prostitution. And then with all of these dynamics, we also bring in a population of female migrant domestic workers who are among the most vulnerable in those kinds of countries, who are abused. And in effect, it is a form of modern slavery. I think that's such a weird word because there's nothing modern about it. But anyway, the idea being that there are people who are even more at risk than we can imagine, whose services are scant, who have no access to support and hardly any networks to tap into, and are literal prisoners in the homes to which they are tied, with passports removed and taken away and doors locked and so on, and facing all sorts of egregious abuses and no time off. So those were some of the things that I worked with. Those are some of the conditions. And then again, dealing with sexual violence in places that are already facing great crises, certainly economic crises, and people desperately needing to get out of bad situations or not wanting to make those situations worse. So looking for opportunities to access safety, to have the resources to be able to stand on their feet, to build a new life, to get away from whatever it is. All of that, plus COVID, which I think has made all of our work so much harder, because suddenly there is a global pandemic that, first of all, while it was a crisis, clearly took away critical resources from women and girls and support networks and spaces that were reallocated for COVID, women not able to leave their homes, those who were now trapped at home with their abusers. Cases of intimate partner violence increased all around the world, everywhere. At that point, I was already living in New York. I had just left Lebanon. So I moved just in time for the pandemic. And I do recall text messaging, for those of us who live in New York City, or maybe you had similar text messaging coming in 6 to 8 times a day at the onset of the pandemic, March 2020, saying, stay home, stay safe, stay home, stay safe. And I thought, well, there's something that is critically missing from that kind of messaging. And there was clearly a population or populations that have not been consulted in the creation of that messaging, because there is an assumption that is dangerous, and that is that home is safe. And while I feel that it should be, and it is a crime that it isn't, for too many women and too many vulnerable groups, it is not safe. So what does that mean? How do you access those kinds of people in a climate where you're told you are safe if you just stay put? So that was extremely dangerous, and that went on for about 6 to 8 weeks. And all of a sudden, somebody else got hold of the text messaging, I suppose, and the tone changed. And it said, well, home might not be safe for everyone. And if you're at risk, call this number and don't worry about it. It's not your fault. And I thought, well, that's too little, too late, as usual. And I think my fundamental argument over all of these decades, and the refrain that I repeat at risk of going deaf and my ears bleeding, is that we just don't listen to women and girls. And if we did, we would be in much better shape. And that is true for the work that I did in Afghanistan and the 2 books I wrote on that subject. I could really summarize them. These are the books that could be a tweet. Just listen to women. And it's true. We didn't. And the risks that we faced and the risks that we forced them to face were magnified as a result. So it is now time. It is long overdue. I'm currently in the process of finalizing a 3rd book, and that is on Arab feminisms and understanding what that means and what that looks like for populations across 22 countries and in the diaspora that are incredibly diverse, that don't have a lot of commonalities. We're combining some of the world's richest countries and some of the world's poorest countries, massive refugee populations, lots of Arabs, like Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and Iraqis and now Yemenis and so on, that are in perpetual crisis and that are a part of the diaspora or on the move within the region, not at all having their needs met, treated in a way that is, well, unwelcome, puts it mildly, actively marginalized and discriminated against at every turn, restricted in terms of what they can do, where they can live, what they can say, who they can be with, where they can go, and certainly at risk, because when it comes to survival, women will tend to do whatever it takes in order to protect themselves and their families, and they are having to do whatever it takes. And so we are forcing people to resort to very risky measures in order to have any basic needs met, in order to live from day to day. So all of those kinds of conditions, come into play when we talk about Arab feminisms. What is that? Is there a feminist movement, singular? Is it plural? Is it Arab? Is it country-based? Is it issue-based? Is it intersectional? Is it organic? What it is actually is very young. The region's population is very young. And the overwhelming belief is that if people want to have any hope in their lives, though, they have to seek that hope elsewhere, outside of those countries. And that becomes very difficult as well, because the countries are in perpetual crisis or on the brink of crisis. So what's been very interesting about that is, what is the place of feminisms, of a women's movement or women's causes, women's rights in those kinds of contexts, especially when we're looking at the so-called tyranny of the urgent, people saying it's not the time for you and your issues right now. We don't have a country, or we don't have an economy, or we don't have a government, or whatever it is, constantly being sidelined and put in second place. And if you are not at the table right now, you will never be at the table. If you are not, well, they say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, which is even more dangerous. So how are we making sure that we don't park feminist causes for later, because that later never seems to arrive in these kinds of countries, and here as well, I'd say. And I think we're all sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for tomorrow. And I'm just about to release a blog talking about how absolutely critical it is. I mean, that's the way I now use my voice independently since I've left the UN, where I spent 2 decades. I left the Arab Institute for Women, where I spent 7 years, and now have just decided to scream on my own. Which has been an interesting position to be in, but also there's a lot of freedom and flexibility in that, and that I can pick up and scream about anything that upsets me in the moment. And there are certainly many, many things. I have a lot more I can say, but I will leave it there, and I would be delighted for questions now in the few minutes we have, afterwards for the weeks and lifetimes to come, because I think this cause is going to take a very long time, and it will take all of us and every ounce of energy we have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.